The story of the British Monarchy, a lineage stretching back through 1,000 years of whispers and triumphs, truly begins in the tumultuous aftermath of Roman withdrawal from Britannia in the early 5th century. Imagine, if you will, a land once neatly ordered by legions and stone roads, now slowly dissolving into a mosaic of smaller, warring territories. The grand villas crumbled, their mosaics fading under encroaching moss, and the echoes of Latin commands grew faint, replaced by the guttural tones of new arrivals. This was a time of shadows and shifting allegiances, a landscape ripe for the emergence of new powers, new identities. For nearly 4 centuries, from roughly 410 AD, when the last Roman legions departed, until the dawn of the 9th century, the island we now call England was not a single entity, but a patchwork quilt of disparate kingdoms, often locked in fierce competition. These were the Anglo-Saxon realms, founded by Germanic tribes, Angles, Saxons and Jutes, who migrated across the North Sea. They brought with them their own gods, their own laws, and their own fierce warrior traditions. The native Romano-British population, those who remained, found themselves increasingly marginalised, their language and customs slowly receding into the western fringes, into what would become Wales and Cornwall, the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, as it's often called. Though the number of kingdoms fluctuated wildly, saw powerful rulers rise and fall, Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex were the most prominent. Each vied for supremacy, their borders fluid, their kings constantly seeking to expand their influence through conquest and strategic marriage. Think of it as a grand, slow-motion chess game, played across a verdant island, where the pieces were armies and the stakes were entire populations. One of the earliest figures to emerge from this mist of legend and fragmented records is King Ethelbert of Kent, who reigned in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. His significance lies not just in his military prowess, but in his pivotal role in the reintroduction of Christianity to Anglo-Saxon England. In 597 AD, Augustine, sent by Pope Gregory I, landed in Kent, bringing with him the message of the gospel. Ethelbert, influenced by his Christian Frankish wife, Bertha, received Augustine and allowed him to preach. This was a monumental shift, as the conversion of the Anglo-Saxon kings gradually led to the establishment of monasteries and bishoprics, which in turn became centres of learning and administration, laying crucial groundwork for future unified governance. The spread of Christianity wasn't always smooth, however. It was a gradual process, often intertwined with political power. Kings would convert. Sometimes their people would follow, sometimes not. There were periods of relapse into paganism, and often the newly established Christian institutions were vulnerable to attack, particularly from Viking raiders in later centuries. Yet the Church provided a unifying cultural force, a common language, Latin for scholarship and liturgy, and a network that transcended the often hostile borders of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. As the centuries progressed, the balance of power shifted. Mercia, under powerful kings like Offa in the late 8th century, achieved a remarkable degree of dominance. Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork stretching for miles along the modern Welsh border, stands as a testament to his ambition and organisational capabilities, a clear demarcation of his kingdom's reach. Historians still debate the primary purpose of Offa's Dyke. Was it purely defensive, a grand statement of power, or a means of controlling trade and movement? Its sheer scale certainly suggests a ruler with immense authority, capable of mobilizing vast resources. Offa even corresponded with Charlemagne, the powerful Frankish emperor, on terms of near equality, suggesting Mercia's considerable standing on the European stage. However, Mercian supremacy was not to last. The late 8th and 9th centuries brought a new, terrifying force to the shores of England, the Vikings. These Norse raiders, initially striking coastal monasteries like Lindisfarne in 793 AD, gradually transitioned from hit-and-run attacks to large-scale invasions and settlement. Their longships, swift and shallow-drafted, allowed them to penetrate deep inland via rivers, bringing chaos and destruction. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, accustomed to fighting each other, were ill-prepared for this coordinated, relentless onslaught. Many fell, their royal lines extinguished, their lands absorbed into what became known as the Danelaw, areas under Viking control. It was against this backdrop of existential threat that the Kingdom of Wessex, in the southwest, began its ascent. While other kingdoms crumbled, Wessex, under a series of capable kings, managed to resist the Viking tide. The most famous of these, undoubtedly, was Alfred the Great, who reigned from 871 to 899 AD. Alfred's early years on the throne were marked by desperate struggle. He suffered significant defeats and was even forced to flee into the Somerset marshes at one point. Yet he persevered. Alfred's genius lay not just in his military reforms, which included the creation of a standing army and a network of fortified burhs, fortifications, to defend against Viking incursions. He also understood the importance of culture, law, and learning in forging a cohesive society. He promoted literacy, translating important Latin works into Old English, and even invited scholars from across Europe to his court. His legal code, drawing on earlier Anglo-Saxon traditions, sought to bring greater order and justice to his realm. Alfred's efforts laid the intellectual and administrative foundations for a more unified English identity, even as much of the island remained under Viking rule. The struggle against the Vikings continued after Alfred's death, led by his son, Edward the Elder, and his grandson, Aethelstan. Aethelstan, who reigned from 925 to 939 AD, is often considered the first true king of England. He achieved a decisive victory over a coalition of Vikings, Scots, and Britons at the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD, a victory celebrated in Old English poetry. This battle was a watershed moment, solidifying Anglo-Saxon control over much of the island and effectively creating a single kingdom, albeit one still grappling with regional differences and the lingering presence of Norse settlers. Aethelstan's court was a vibrant international hub, reflecting his ambition and prestige. He forged alliances with European rulers, marrying his sisters into prominent continental dynasties. He even styled himself King of the English and King of the Britons, signalling a claim to authority over the entire island. The coinage issued during his reign reflects this growing sense of a unified realm, with standardized designs circulating widely. However, the path to a truly stable, unified monarchy was still fraught with challenges. The 10th century saw periods of strong rule, followed by weaker reigns, internal rebellions, and renewed Viking attacks. The concept of a single, indivisible English crown was still evolving, often dependent on the personal strength and charisma of the monarch. The Witan, a council of leading churchmen and nobles, played a significant role in electing or approving kings, indicating that primogeniture, inheritance by the eldest son, was not yet firmly established. This meant that succession could be a contentious affair, leading to civil strife. The late 10th and early 11th centuries brought another wave of intense Viking pressure, culminating in the reign of Ethelred the Unready, a king whose epithet, unread, actually means ill-counselled or no counsel, rather than simply unready. His reign was marked by a disastrous policy of paying Danegeld, tribute to the Vikings, which only encouraged further raids. Eventually, England fell under Danish rule, first under Sweyn Forkbeard, and then more famously under his son Knut the Great, who ruled a vast North Sea empire encompassing England, Denmark, and Norway from 1016 to 1035 AD. Knut's reign, though foreign, brought a period of relative stability and prosperity to England. He respected English law and customs, embraced Christianity, and even went on pilgrimage to Rome. His rule demonstrated that England, despite its turbulent past, was a prize worth holding, a wealthy and strategically important kingdom. After Knut's death, his empire fragmented, and the Anglo-Saxon line was briefly restored with Edward the Confessor, a pious but somewhat detached king who spent much of his early life in exile in Normandy. Edward's reign, from 1042 to 1066, was characterized by growing Norman influence at court and a complex succession crisis that would ultimately lead to the most famous invasion in English history. He died childless, leaving a tangled web of claims to the throne, including those of his brother-in-law, Harold Godwinson, the powerful Earl of Wessex, William, Duke of Normandy, and Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway. This period vividly illustrates how precarious the nascent English monarchy still was. How easily it could be swayed by external forces and internal rivalries. The very idea of a unified English crown, painstakingly built over centuries, hung precariously in the balance. If you're enjoying this, make sure to subscribe and leave in the comments the time and place you're listening from. The chill wind that swept across the field of Senlac Hill on that fateful October day in 1066 carried with it the scent of destiny, forever altering the trajectory of England. Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king, fell, struck down by an arrow or perhaps by the swords of Norman knights, a detail still debated by historians. With his demise, the ancient Anglo-Saxon order, rooted in its shires and wittenagemots, crumbled, making way for a new, formidable power. William, Duke of Normandy, now known as William the Conqueror, claimed the throne, not merely as a victor, but as the rightful heir, a claim he meticulously propagated through chronicles and charters. His coronation on Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey, was a stark symbol of this seismic shift. The English chroniclers recorded the event with a mixture of awe and apprehension, noting the confusion and fear among the populace as Norman guards, mistaking cheers for rebellion, set fire to nearby houses. This was not just a change of monarch, but a profound cultural and political upheaval. William, a man of ruthless efficiency and strategic brilliance, wasted no time in consolidating his grip. He initiated the wholesale replacement of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with his Norman loyalists, dispossessing native landowners and granting vast estates to his followers. This created a new, powerful Norman elite, bound to the king by feudal ties, ensuring loyalty and military service. The Norman conquest also brought about a revolution in land ownership and administration. The Domesday Book, commissioned by William in 1085, stands as a monumental testament to his administrative genius and desire for absolute control. This comprehensive survey, meticulously cataloguing every acre of land, every plough, every pig, and every person in England, was unprecedented in its scope. It served not only as a basis for taxation, but also as a definitive record of who owned what, solidifying the king's ultimate authority over all land. The very name, Domesday, evoked the finality of the Last Judgment, leaving no appeal against its pronouncements. This meticulous record-keeping allowed the Crown to assert its rights and revenues with unparalleled precision, laying the groundwork for a more centralized state. Beyond land, the Normans imported their language, French, which became the language of the court, law, and administration for centuries. While English continued to be spoken by the common people, Latin remained the language of the church and scholarship. This linguistic stratification created a distinct social hierarchy, with French speakers at the apex. Over time, these languages began to intertwine, giving birth to Middle English, a rich tapestry woven from Germanic and Romance threads. The legal system also underwent a transformation. Norman common law, based on custom and precedent, began to supersede the diverse local laws of the Anglo-Saxons, creating a more unified legal framework across the realm. The Norman kings, unlike their Anglo-Saxon predecessors, were also dukes of a powerful continental territory. This dual identity inextricably linked England to European affairs, drawing it into the complex web of continental politics, alliances, and conflicts. The building of castles, a hallmark of Norman rule, further cemented their power. These formidable stone structures, like the Tower of London, rising majestically above the Thames, were not merely defensive strongholds, but symbols of Norman dominance, projecting royal authority into every corner of the kingdom. They served as administrative centres, prisons, and garrisons, ensuring the king's writ ran unchallenged. The successors of William the Conqueror continued the work of consolidating royal power. Henry I, William's youngest son, despite initially facing challenges to his claim, proved to be a skilled administrator. He strengthened the royal courts and the exchequer, the financial department of the government, making them more efficient and central to the kingdom's governance. His reign, though marred by the tragic loss of his only legitimate son, William Adelin, in the White Ship disaster of 1120, laid important foundations for future royal authority. This disaster plunged England into a period of civil war known as the Anarchy, after Henry's death, as his daughter Matilda and her cousin Stephen vied for the throne. The ensuing chaos, marked by widespread lawlessness and the unchecked power of local barons, highlighted the fragility of royal authority when unchallenged, and underscored the desperate need for a strong, undisputed monarch. Order was eventually restored with the ascension of Henry II in 1154, the first of the Plantagenet kings. Henry II was a monarch of immense energy and ambition, whose reign marked a pivotal moment in the development of English law and governance. He inherited a vast Angevin empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, making him one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. His most enduring legacy, however, lies in his legal reforms. He established a system of royal justice that began to supersede local feudal courts, sending royal judges on circuits throughout the country. This not only brought greater consistency to legal judgments, but also increased the king's revenue through fines and fees. He introduced the jury system, a revolutionary concept where local men, rather than just the accused and accuser, would present facts to a judge. This innovation, though different from modern juries, was a crucial step towards a more equitable and centralized legal system. Henry II's ambition, however, brought him into a bitter conflict with the Church, specifically with Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, whom Henry had appointed, believing he would be a compliant ally. Becket, once a close friend and chancellor, transformed into a staunch defender of ecclesiastical rights, refusing to yield to the king's attempts to bring clerics under royal jurisdiction. The dispute culminated in Becket's dramatic murder in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170 by 4 of Henry's knights, who misinterpreted the king's frustrated outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" This act shocked Christendom and forced Henry to perform public penance, demonstrating the enduring power of the Church even against a formidable monarch. Historians still debate the extent of Henry's direct culpability, whether it was a direct order or a tragic consequence of his impulsive words. The reigns of Henry's sons, Richard I, known as the Lionheart, and John, were marked by different challenges. Richard, a legendary warrior, spent most of his 10-year reign on crusade or defending his continental possessions, leaving England largely to the administration of his ministers. His absence, while celebrated in song and legend, placed a significant financial burden on the kingdom, as vast sums were raised for his military campaigns and ransom. It was during the reign of his younger brother, King John, that royal power faced its most significant challenge since the Conquest. John, often portrayed as a tyrannical and incompetent ruler, lost most of his continental territories to the French king Philip II, earning him the moniker Lackland. His heavy taxation and arbitrary rule alienated his barons, who, emboldened by his weakness and failures, rose in rebellion. The culmination of this discontent was the signing of Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215. Magna Carta, or the Great Charter, was not initially a document championing universal rights, but rather a peace treaty between a king and his rebellious barons, primarily concerned with feudal grievances and the rights of free men. It limited the king's power, asserting that even the monarch was subject to the law. Clauses within it protected certain liberties, such as the right to a fair trial by one's peers, and the principle that no free man could be imprisoned or dispossessed without due process of law. While many of its provisions were soon ignored or reinterpreted, Magna Carta's enduring significance lies in its symbolic power as a foundational document for constitutionalism and the rule of law. It established the principle that royal power was not absolute and could be challenged, laying the groundwork for future parliamentary development. The 13th century saw the gradual evolution of parliament, a term derived from the French word parlement, meaning a talking. While earlier councils had advised kings, Simon de Montfort, a powerful baron leading a rebellion against Henry III, John's son, summoned a parliament in 1265 that included representatives from the shires and boroughs, a significant step towards wider representation. Edward I, known as Longshanks, and the English Justinian, further developed Parliament. Recognizing its utility as a means of raising taxes and gaining consent for his ambitious military campaigns, particularly against Wales and Scotland. His model parliament of 1295, which included representatives of the clergy, nobility, and commoners, set a precedent for future parliamentary structure. Edward I's reign was characterized by a relentless pursuit of royal authority and the expansion of English dominion. He conquered Wales, building a ring of magnificent castles like Caernarfon and Conwy to solidify his control, and famously presented his son, the future Edward II, as the first English Prince of Wales. His attempts to conquer Scotland, however, met with fierce resistance from figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, leading to prolonged and costly wars that would stretch into the next century. These conflicts, while draining the royal coffers, also fostered a nascent sense of English national identity, distinct from its continental origins. The High Middle Ages, from the Norman Conquest to the end of the 13th century, witnessed the profound transformation of the English monarchy. From a relatively decentralized Anglo-Saxon kingdom, England evolved into a more centralized state with a sophisticated legal and administrative apparatus. The Norman yoke, initially imposed by force, gradually integrated with existing traditions, creating a unique synthesis. The power of the crown, though periodically challenged by powerful barons and the church, grew steadily, laying the essential foundations for the future development of the British monarchy and the nation itself. The echoes of William's Domesday Book, Henry II's legal reforms, and the enduring principles of Magna Carta would resonate through the centuries, shaping the destiny of kings and commoners alike. The soft glow of the Plantagenet sun, once so brilliant, began to dim, casting long, uncertain shadows across the English landscape. The year 1399 marked a profound shift, a tremor that would eventually fracture the very foundation of the monarchy. Richard II, a king who had inherited the crown as a mere boy, faced a growing tide of discontent. His reign, marked by periods of autocratic rule and a perceived disregard for the established rights of his nobles, alienated powerful figures within the realm. One such figure was Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, a cousin to the king and son of John of Gaunt, the powerful Duke of Lancaster. When Richard banished both Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, the stage was set for a dramatic confrontation. Upon John of Gaunt's death, Richard seized his vast estates, an act that stripped Bolingbroke of his rightful inheritance and ignited the spark of rebellion. Henry Bolingbroke, exiled and dispossessed, returned to England not as a humble petitioner, but as a challenger. He landed in Yorkshire, initially claiming only to reclaim his inheritance, but quickly gathered support from disaffected nobles and commoners alike. Richard II, returning from a campaign in Ireland, found his kingdom slipping through his fingers. His forces dwindled, his allies abandoned him, and he was eventually captured. In a scene of unprecedented political theatre, Richard II was compelled to abdicate his throne in favour of Henry Bolingbroke, who, with the support of Parliament, was crowned King Henry IV. This act, the deposition of an anointed king, was a radical departure from tradition and set a dangerous precedent. It introduced a new unsettling question. If a king could be removed, what truly secured the crown? The Lancastrian dynasty, born from this usurpation, would spend much of its existence grappling with the legitimacy of its claim. Henry IV faced numerous rebellions throughout his reign, constantly battling to consolidate his power and prove his right to rule. His son, Henry V, a figure of immense charisma and military prowess, managed to temporarily silence these doubts through the resounding victories of the 100 Years' War, most notably at Agincourt in 1415. The image of the warrior king, leading his outnumbered English forces to triumph against the French, instilled a sense of national pride and unity that momentarily eclipsed the the dynastic questions. Yet, this golden age was fleeting. Upon Henry V's untimely death in 1422, the crown passed to his infant son, Henry VI, a mere 9 months old. This long minority, coupled with the eventual loss of most English territories in France, began to unravel the hard-won stability. Henry VI grew into a gentle, pious man, deeply devoted to religion and learning, but tragically ill-suited for the harsh realities of medieval kingship. He suffered from periods of profound mental illness, rendering him incapable of effective governance. During these episodes, the reins of power were often seized by ambitious factions within the court, leading to bitter rivalries and a weakening of central authority. The very fabric of English society, already strained by decades of war and economic hardship, began to fray. The lack of a strong hand at the helm allowed the simmering resentments between the great noble houses to boil over. The rivalry between the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, represented by the white rose, became increasingly pronounced. Both houses were descended from Edward III, and both had legitimate, albeit differing, claims to the throne. The Lancastrians, through Henry IV, held the crown by right of conquest and parliamentary sanction. The Yorkists, through Richard, Duke of York, argued for a stronger hereditary claim, tracing their lineage through Edward III's second son, Lionel of Antwerp, Duke of Clarence, whereas the Lancastrians descended from Edward III's third son, John of Gaunt. This genealogy, ical nuance, often overlooked in the simplified narrative, was a crucial point of contention. The year 1455 is often cited as the beginning of the Wars of the Roses, though the seeds of conflict had been sown decades earlier. The First Battle of St. Albans saw the Yorkist forces, led by Richard, Duke of York, clash with the Lancastrian loyalists. The battle, though relatively small in scale, was significant because it marked the first time English nobles openly fought each other under the banners of the Two Roses. The Duke of York, emboldened by his victory, sought to assert his claim more forcefully. The ensuing decades were a brutal dance of power, marked by shifting alliances, betrayals, and devastating battles that tore families and communities apart. Historians still debate the precise nature and extent of popular involvement in the Wars of the Roses. While often portrayed as a struggle between two elite noble families, the conflict undoubtedly drew in thousands of commoners, pressed into service by their lords or driven by their own allegiances. The impact on daily life for ordinary people was immense, with armies marching across the land, requisitioning supplies, and disrupting trade. Imagine the fear and uncertainty that must have gripped a small village as news arrived of an approaching army, not knowing whether they were friend or foe, or what demands would be made upon them. One of the most poignant figures in this tumultuous period was Margaret of Anjou, Queen Consort to Henry VI. A formidable and determined woman, she became the de facto leader of the Lancastrian cause during her husband's periods of incapacitation. She fought fiercely to protect her son's inheritance and often led armies herself, displaying a courage and tenacity rarely seen in queens of her era. Her unwavering resolve, however, sometimes bordered on ruthlessness, earning her the moniker She-Wolf of France from her Yorkist enemies. Her story is a testament to the extraordinary pressures placed upon women in positions of power during a time of relentless conflict. The fortunes of the two houses swung back and forth like a pendulum. Richard, Duke of York, was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, a seemingly decisive Lancastrian victory. But his son, Edward, a charismatic and militarily gifted young man, quickly avenged his father's death. Edward IV, as he became, seized the throne in 1461, becoming the first Yorkist king. His reign, punctuated by further Lancastrian attempts to regain the crown, brought a period of relative stability. He was a pragmatic ruler, skilled in both warfare and diplomacy, and he worked to restore order to the kingdom. Yet the shadow of dynastic instability never truly lifted. Edward IV's decision to marry Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner widow with children from a previous marriage, rather than a European princess, caused considerable scandal and alienated many of his powerful allies, most notably Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker. Warwick, who had been instrumental in placing Edward on the throne, felt slighted and eventually switched his allegiance back to the Lancastrian cause, briefly restoring Henry VI to the throne in 1470. This remarkable turn of events, a king deposed and then restored, only to be deposed again, highlights the fluidity and unpredictability of the conflict. Edward IV, however, was not easily defeated. He returned from exile, defeated Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, and ultimately crushed the last vestiges of Lancastrian resistance at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1470. This battle saw the death of Henry VI's only son, Edward, Prince of Wales, effectively ending the direct Lancastrian line. Shortly thereafter, the deposed Henry VI himself died in the Tower of London, likely murdered, though the official cause was reported as melancholy. With the Lancastrian threat seemingly extinguished, Edward IV enjoyed a more secure second reign, focusing on rebuilding, holding the kingdom and strengthening royal finances. However, the peace was fragile. Upon Edward IV's sudden death in 1483, his young sons, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, became the new focus of the dynastic struggle. Their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed Lord Protector. What followed is one of the most enduring mysteries in English history: the fate of the princes in the Tower. The young king, Edward V, and his brother were lodged in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their protection, but they were never seen again. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, swiftly moved to seize the throne, claiming his nephews were illegitimate. He was crowned Richard III. The disappearance of the princes remains an unsolved puzzle. Did Richard III order their deaths to secure his claim? Or were they eliminated by someone else, perhaps Henry Tudor? Who would eventually challenge Richard? The bones of two children, found in the Tower of London in the 17th century, are widely believed to be those of the princes, but definitive proof remains elusive. This enduring mystery continues to fuel historical debate and has inspired countless works of fiction, highlighting the profound human drama at the heart of these power struggles. Richard III's reign, though brief, was marked by the shadow of usurpation and the lingering suspicion surrounding his nephews. He faced immediate opposition, and a new claimant emerged from the shadows: Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian relative who had spent much of his life in exile. Henry's claim was tenuous, but he represented a potential end to the endless cycle of civil war. He gathered support from disaffected Yorkists and Lancastrians alike, uniting them under a new banner. The final, decisive confrontation of the Wars of the Roses occurred at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Richard III, a brave but ultimately isolated figure, led his forces into battle. Accounts describe him fighting valiantly, even charging directly at Henry Tudor in a desperate attempt to end the conflict with a single blow. But he was ultimately overwhelmed and killed, the last English king to die in battle. The crown, famously, was found in a hawthorn bush and placed upon Henry Tudor's head, marking the dawn of a new dynasty. Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, understood the precariousness of his position. He was a king by conquest, not by clear hereditary right. To solidify his claim and, more importantly, to unite the warring factions, he made a strategic and brilliant move. He married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, and a strong Yorkist claimant in her own right. This marriage symbolically merged the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York, creating the Tudor rose and ushering in an era of peace and stability after decades of bloodshed. The Wars of the Roses, a period of immense suffering and upheaval, finally drew to a close, leaving behind a kingdom forever changed and a monarchy that had been tested and reshaped by the crucible of conflict. The scars of those battles would linger, but a new chapter had begun, promising a different kind of royal power, one that would strive for centralized authority and a more unified nation. The chilling whispers of the Wars of the Roses had finally begun to fade, replaced by a new, if still uncertain, dawn. Henry Tudor, having seized the crown at Bosworth Field in 1485, understood the fragility of his victory. He was a king by conquest, a claim strengthened by his marriage to Elizabeth of York, uniting the warring houses of Lancaster and York. Their union was a deliberate act of reconciliation, a symbolic balm poured over the nation's wounds. The Tudor rose, a hybrid of red and white, became the emblem of this new era, promising unity and stability after decades of bloodshed. Henry VII, as he was now known, was a shrewd and pragmatic ruler. He inherited a kingdom depleted by war, its nobility fractured and its treasury bare. His reign was not marked by grand military conquests, but by quiet, methodical reconstruction. He focused on restoring royal authority, curbing the power of the great magnates, and, crucially, replenishing the royal coffers. He achieved this not through heavy taxation, which could spark rebellion, but through innovative and sometimes unpopular financial policies. The Star Chamber, initially designed to ensure impartial justice, became a tool for enforcing royal will, often against recalcitrant nobles. His reign was a careful dance of consolidation, laying the groundwork for the more flamboyant reigns that would follow. He sought alliances through marriage, marrying his eldest son, Arthur, to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, a union designed to cement England's place on the European stage. Yet even as Henry VII meticulously rebuilt his kingdom, the seeds of future upheaval were being sown, not in battlefields, but in the quiet chambers of theological debate. Across the continent, the intellectual currents of the Renaissance were challenging old ways of thinking. And the spiritual authority of the Roman Catholic Church was increasingly questioned. When Henry VII died in 1509, the crown passed to his second son, Henry VIII, a young man of immense charisma, athletic prowess, and a keen intellect. Unlike his cautious father, Henry VIII was a king who craved glory, both on the battlefield and in the realm of ideas. He initially presented himself as a staunch defender of the Catholic faith, even earning the title Defender of the Faith from the Pope for his treatise against Martin Luther's burgeoning Protestant ideas. But destiny, or perhaps his own restless ambition, had other plans. The pivotal turning point in Henry VIII's reign, and indeed in the history of England, revolved around a desperate need for a male heir. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, though initially strong, had failed to produce a surviving son. Several pregnancies ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, and only one child, Princess Mary, survived to adulthood. In an age where dynastic stability hinged on male succession, the lack of a legitimate male heir was a profound crisis. Henry became convinced that his marriage to Catherine, his brother's widow, was cursed, a violation of biblical law, and therefore invalid in the eyes of God. He sought an annulment from Pope Clement VII, arguing that the original papal dispensation allowing his marriage to Catherine was flawed. However, the Pope, under the political sway of Catherine's nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was unwilling to grant the annulment. This refusal ignited a monumental clash between king and pope, a struggle for both personal desire and ultimate authority. Henry, frustrated by the pope's intransigence, began to explore alternative paths. His eye had also fallen upon Anne Boleyn, a lady of the court whose intelligence and charm captivated him. Anne, however, refused to be merely a royal mistress. She demanded the status of queen. This personal desire intertwined inextricably with the king's dynastic anxieties and his growing conviction that he, as monarch, held ultimate spiritual authority within his own realm. With the support of his chief minister Thomas Cromwell and the newly appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, Henry began to dismantle centuries of papal authority in England. A series of parliamentary acts, starting in the early 1530s, systematically severed England's ties with Rome. The Act in Restraint of Appeals, 1533, declared that the English monarch was the supreme head of the Church of England, effectively preventing appeals to the Pope. The Act of Supremacy, 1534, solidified this, making Henry VIII the supreme head on earth of the Church of England. This was not merely a theological shift. It was a profound assertion of national sovereignty, placing the king at the apex of both temporal and spiritual power within his kingdom. The English Reformation, unlike the more dogmatic Protestant movements on the continent, was initially a top-down revolution driven by royal prerogative rather than popular theological fervour. While some within England harboured genuine Protestant sympathies, the majority of the population remained deeply Catholic in their beliefs and practices. The dissolution of the monasteries, beginning in 1536, was a consequence of this break with Rome. These wealthy institutions, long seen as bastions of papal influence and often criticised for their perceived corruption, were systematically seized by the Crown. Their vast lands and immense wealth were confiscated, providing a much-needed financial windfall for Henry VIII and enriching a new class of landowners who supported the Reformation. This act had profound social and economic consequences, displacing thousands of monks and nuns and destroying centuries of cultural and religious heritage. Many magnificent abbeys and priories, once centres of learning and charity, were reduced to ruins, their stones repurposed for new buildings. This period also saw the first authorised English translation of the Bible, which, though initially controversial, slowly began to empower ordinary people to engage with Scripture directly, rather than relying solely on priestly interpretation. The religious landscape of England became a tumultuous sea, buffeted by shifting winds. Henry VIII, despite his break with Rome, remained largely Catholic in his personal theology, persecuting both ardent Protestants and those who refused to acknowledge his supremacy, such as Sir Thomas More, who was executed for treason. After Anne Boleyn failed to produce a male heir and was executed on charges of treason and adultery in 1536, Henry married Jane Seymour, who finally bore him a son, the future Edward VI. Sadly, Jane died shortly after childbirth, leaving Henry to marry 3 more times in his quest for dynastic security and personal fulfillment. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the crown passed to his young son, Edward VI, who was just 9 years old. Edward, a devout and intelligent boy, had been raised with strong Protestant convictions. During his brief reign, guided by his regents, England moved further towards Protestantism. The Book of Common Prayer, compiled by Archbishop Cranmer, was introduced, providing a standardized liturgy in English, replacing the Latin Mass. Images were removed from churches, and many Catholic rituals were suppressed. This period saw a significant, though not universally accepted, shift in religious practice across the country. However, Edward's reign was tragically short. He died in 1553 at the age of 15, likely from tuberculosis. The succession then passed to his half-sister, Mary I, daughter of Catherine of Aragon. Mary, a staunch and devout Catholic, was determined to restore England to the Roman fold. Her reign, though also brief, was marked by a fervent and often brutal attempt to reverse the Reformation. She reinstated papal authority, repealed Protestant legislation, and began persecuting Protestants, earning her the grim moniker Bloody Mary. Hundreds were burned at the stake for heresy, a grim spectacle that, while ended to suppress dissent, ultimately hardened many against Catholicism. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain, a powerful Catholic monarch, further fueled English anxieties about foreign domination and papal influence. Historians still debate whether Mary's intense persecution was primarily driven by religious zeal or by a desperate attempt to secure her dynasty and legitimacy, given the tumultuous circumstances of her mother's divorce. Her efforts to restore Catholicism, however, proved ultimately unsustainable, largely due to the strength of anti-Spanish sentiment and the growing number of people who had benefited from the dissolution of the monasteries or had embraced Protestant ideas. Mary's death in 1558 brought her half-sister, Elizabeth I, to the throne. Daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's legitimacy had been questioned throughout her life, making her position precarious. She inherited a nation deeply divided by religious strife, exhausted by political instability, and facing threats from powerful European rivals. Elizabeth, however, was a monarch of extraordinary intelligence, political acumen, and a deep understanding of her people. She sought a middle path, a religious settlement that could accommodate both Catholic and Protestant sensibilities, thereby bringing stability to the kingdom. The Elizabethan religious settlement, enshrined in the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity, 1559, re-established the monarch as the supreme governor of the Church of England, a slightly softer title than supreme head, and reintroduced the Book of Common Prayer, albeit with some revisions to make it more palatable to those with Catholic leanings. This pragmatic approach aimed for outward conformity rather than strict theological uniformity, famously stating she had no desire to make windows into men's souls. Elizabeth's reign, lasting 45 years, became known as England's Golden Age. She skillfully navigated the treacherous waters of European power politics, often playing rival nations against each other. Her refusal to marry, famously declaring herself married to her kingdom, became a powerful symbol of her dedication and independence. She fostered a flourishing of arts and literature, with figures like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe producing some of the greatest works in the English language. This period also saw the rise of English maritime power and exploration. Sir Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, and English privateers, often with royal backing, harassed Spanish shipping, enriching England and challenging Spain's global dominance. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. A massive invasion fleet sent by Philip II of Spain to restore Catholicism and conquer England was a defining moment. Though aided by fierce storms, the English navy, smaller but more agile and expertly led, inflicted a decisive defeat, cementing England's position as a major naval power and bolstering national pride. The Tudor monarchs, from Henry VII's careful consolidation to Elizabeth I's masterful statesmanship, fundamentally transformed England. They centralized royal power, created a national church, and laid the foundations for a powerful maritime empire. The English Reformation, though born of a king's personal desire, irrevocably altered the nation's religious, political, and social fabric. It fostered a distinct English identity, separate from continental Catholicism, and set England on a path that would see it emerge as a dominant force on the world stage. The echoes of these transformations would reverberate for centuries, shaping the very character of the British monarchy and the nation it governed. The stories of their triumphs and tribulations, their personal passions, and their profound impact on history continued to weave themselves into the tapestry of the land, whispering through the ancient stones of their castles and cathedrals, waiting for new ears to listen. The tapestry of England, woven with threads of Tudor ambition and Reformation fervour, began to fray under the touch of a new dynasty. When Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudors, passed from the world in 1603, leaving no direct heir, the crown found its way to her cousin, James VI of Scotland. He became James I of England, uniting the two crowns in a personal union, though the kingdoms themselves remained distinct. This was a king who believed profoundly in the divine right of monarchs, a concept that held kings were appointed by God and accountable only to him. This conviction, deeply ingrained in his psyche, would set the stage for generations of conflict, a slow-burning fuse that would eventually ignite a civil war. James, a scholar and a prolific writer, saw himself as a philosopher king, yet his reign was marked by increasing tension. His lavish spending, coupled with his belief that Parliament existed merely to approve his wishes, led to frequent clashes over money. He dissolved Parliament several times when they dared to challenge his authority or his financial demands. One particularly thorny issue was his desire for closer ties with Catholic Spain, a policy deeply unpopular with his Protestant subjects, many of whom still remembered the Spanish Armada. He even attempted to marry his son, Charles, to a Spanish infanta, a move that stirred widespread unease and suspicion among the English populace, who feared a return to Catholic dominance. This persistent friction over finance and foreign policy laid the groundwork for the tumultuous reign of his son. When Charles I ascended the throne in 1625, he inherited not only his father's crown, but also his profound belief in divine right and his financial woes. Charles, a man of refined tastes and artistic sensibilities, was also deeply reserved and somewhat inflexible. He lacked his father's common touch and ability to charm, often appearing aloof and unyielding. His marriage to Henrietta Maria, a French Catholic princess, further fueled Protestant anxieties, and her influence at court was often viewed with suspicion. Like his father, Charles found himself in constant need of funds, particularly to finance costly wars with Spain and France. When Parliament refused to grant him sufficient money without addressing their grievances, Charles resorted to increasingly desperate measures. He imposed forced loans on his subjects, imprisoned those who refused to pay, and even quartered soldiers in private homes, all without parliamentary consent. These actions, perceived as arbitrary and tyrannical, led Parliament in 1628 to present Charles with the Petition of Right. This document, a landmark in English constitutional history, asserted 4 key principles: no taxation without Parliament's consent, no imprisonment without cause, no quartering of soldiers on subjects without their will, and no martial law in peacetime. Charles, facing immense pressure and needing funds, reluctantly assented to the petition. However, his agreement was short-lived. He soon found ways to circumvent its spirit, continuing to raise money through various means, such as ship money, a tax traditionally levied on coastal towns for naval defence, which he extended to inland counties during peacetime, arguing it was for national security. This was a particularly contentious issue, as it was levied without parliamentary approval, striking at the heart of the principle of no taxation without consent. The years that followed, from 1629 to 1640, became known as the 11 Years' Tyranny, or the personal rule, of Charles I. During this period, Charles ruled without Parliament, relying on his prerogative powers and the advice of a small circle of trusted advisers, most notably Thomas Wentworth, later Earl of Strafford, and Archbishop William Laud. A staunch Anglican, sought to impose greater uniformity in the Church of England, moving it closer to traditional Catholic practices, such as elaborate rituals and ornate church decorations. This was deeply unsettling to many Puritans, who saw these reforms as a dangerous slide back towards Catholicism and an infringement on their religious freedom. Laud's policies, enforced through the Court of High Commission and the Star Chamber, courts that operated outside common law and often without juries, led to the persecution of religious dissidents, further alienating a significant portion of the population. The breaking point came in Scotland. Charles, attempting to impose a new Anglican prayer book on the Presbyterian Scots, sparked a rebellion. The Scots, fiercely protective of their religious independence, signed the National Covenant in 1638, pledging to resist any attempts to alter their church. Charles, lacking funds to suppress the Scottish Covenanters, was forced to recall Parliament in 1640. First, the Short Parliament, which he quickly dissolved, and then the Long Parliament, which would sit for 13 years and fundamentally reshape the English government. This Long Parliament, unlike its predecessors, was determined to curb the king's power. Led by figures like John Pym, they systematically dismantled the apparatus of Charles's personal rule. They abolished the Star Chamber and the Court of High Commission, declared ship money illegal, and passed the Triennial Act, which mandated that Parliament must be called at least every 3 years. They even impeached and executed Charles's chief advisers, Strafford and Laud, a clear demonstration of Parliament's newfound assertiveness and a shocking blow to the king's authority. However, the question of ultimate sovereignty remained unresolved. Who held the supreme power, the king or Parliament? This was the fundamental question that historians still debate regarding the true cause of the English Civil War. Was it primarily a constitutional struggle, a religious conflict, or a social revolution? While religious differences certainly fueled passions and social grievances played a role, the core disagreement revolved around the balance of power between the monarch and the representative body. The Grand Remonstrance, passed by Parliament in 1641, was a list of grievances against Charles's reign, further widening the chasm between king and Parliament. Charles, feeling increasingly cornered, made a desperate and unprecedented move in January 1642. He marched into the House of Commons with an armed guard, intending to arrest 5 leading members whom he accused of treason. The members, forewarned, had already fled, and Charles's audacious act was seen as a grave violation of parliamentary privilege and an assault on the very foundations of English liberty. This act, more than any other, shattered any remaining trust and pushed England irrevocably towards civil war. Both sides began to raise armies. The king's supporters, largely drawn from the aristocracy, gentry, and those who favoured the established church, became known as the Cavaliers, often depicted with long, flowing hair and elaborate dress. Parliament's forces, composed largely of merchants, artisans, and Puritan gentry, were called the Roundheads due to their closely cropped hair, a practical style that also symbolised their rejection of aristocratic fashion. The first major battle, the Battle of Edgehill in October 1642, was indecisive, signalling that this would be a long and bloody conflict. The war raged across England, a brutal and destructive period that tore families and communities apart. Early in the war, the Cavaliers, with their experienced cavalry, often held the advantage. However, Parliament's forces, particularly under the leadership of a rising military genius named Oliver Cromwell, began to gain the upper hand. Cromwell, a devout Puritan and a member of Parliament, recognised the need for a professional, disciplined army. He formed the New Model Army, a highly effective fighting force based on merit rather than social standing, whose soldiers were rigorously trained and imbued with strong religious conviction. Their distinctive red coats and disciplined ranks became a formidable sight on the battlefield. The New Model Army's decisive victories at Marston Moor in 1644 and Naseby in 1645 effectively broke the king's power. Charles I, defeated and on the run, eventually surrendered to the Scottish army in 1646, who then handed him over to Parliament. The war, however, did not end the divisions. Within Parliament, there were ongoing debates about the future of the monarchy and the settlement of the nation. Some, like the Presbyterians, sought a negotiated settlement with the king, perhaps with a more limited monarchy. Others, particularly the more radical independents within the army, favoured a complete overhaul of the political and religious system. The army, now a powerful political force in its own right, grew increasingly frustrated with Parliament's indecision and its attempts to disband them without settling their arrears of pay. In December 1648, a pivotal event known as Pride's Purge occurred. Colonel Thomas Pride, acting under the orders of the army, forcibly removed those members of Parliament who were still willing to negotiate with Charles. This left a much smaller, more radical Rump Parliament. which was dominated by those who favoured bringing the king to justice. This lesser-known detail of the revolution highlights the extent to which military power had come to overshadow parliamentary authority. The Rump Parliament, under immense pressure from the army, then took the unprecedented step of putting Charles I on trial for treason against the people of England. This was a revolutionary act, as no English monarch had ever been tried by his own subjects. Charles, maintaining his belief in divine right, refused to recognize the legitimacy of the court, arguing that he was answerable only to God. Despite his eloquent defense and the profound implications of their actions, the court found him guilty. On January 30th, 1649, Charles I was executed outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, London. His last words, spoken from the scaffold, maintained his innocence and his belief in his divine right. Stating he was a martyr of the people, the fall of the king sent shockwaves across Europe. It was a moment of profound rupture, not just for England, but for the very concept of monarchy. The ancient institution, once believed to be divinely ordained and immutable, had been overthrown by its own people. With the king dead, England was declared a commonwealth, a republic without a monarch. This period, from 1649 to 1660, was a radical experiment in republican government. Oliver Cromwell, the architect of the new model army, emerged as the dominant figure. He ruthlessly suppressed royalist uprisings in Ireland and Scotland, campaigns that left a lasting and bitter legacy, particularly in Ireland, where his actions led to widespread death and displacement. Cromwell, though a brilliant military commander, struggled to establish a stable political system. The Rump Parliament, despite its initial radicalism, proved to be ineffective and unwilling to dissolve itself. In 1653, Cromwell, exasperated, forcibly dissolved Parliament, declaring that they had become corrupt and self-serving. He then established the Protectorate, becoming Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland. This effectively made him a military dictator, ruling with the support of the army. The Protectorate, though it brought a degree of stability and order after years of war, was deeply unpopular with many. Cromwell's rule was characterized by puritanical social reforms, including the closing of theatres, the banning of Christmas celebrations, and a general crackdown on what were considered immoral activities. While these measures reflected Cromwell's sincere religious beliefs, they were often resented by a populace accustomed to more traditional pastimes. Perhaps these restrictions, imposed by a military government, inadvertently fostered a longing for the old ways, for the return of the monarchy and its familiar rhythms. Cromwell, a man of immense conviction and military prowess, repeatedly refused the offer of the crown, perhaps genuinely fearing the taint of kingship or recognizing the deep-seated republican sentiment within his army. His rule, though authoritarian, was not without its achievements. He strengthened England's navy, pursued an aggressive foreign policy that enhanced England's standing on the world stage, and ensured religious toleration for most Protestant denominations, though not for Catholics or Anglicans who continued to practice the old ways. When Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, his son Richard briefly succeeded him as Lord Protector. However, Richard lacked his father's authority and military support. The Protectorate quickly unravelled amidst political instability and military infighting. The English people, weary of years of republican experimentation, military rule, and social upheaval, began to long for the stability and familiarity of the monarchy. General George Monk, a key military figure, recognizing the public mood and the chaos gripping the nation, marched his army to London and facilitated the return of the monarchy. Negotiations began with Charles II, the eldest son of the executed king who had been living in exile on the continent. In 1660, Charles II issued the Declaration of Breda, promising a general pardon for most actions committed during the Civil War and interregnum, religious toleration, and the payment of army arrears. In May 1660, Charles II triumphantly entered London, marking the restoration of the monarchy. The crowds that greeted him were jubilant, signalling a collective sigh of relief and a desire for a return to normalcy after decades of conflict and radical change. The Stuart dynasty was back on the throne, but the world they returned to was profoundly different. The Civil War and the execution of Charles I had forever altered the relationship between the monarch and Parliament. While the concept of divine right was still espoused by some, the practical reality was that no future English monarch could ever again rule without the consent of Parliament. The absolute power of the crown had been irrevocably broken, paving the way for the gradual evolution of a constitutional monarchy, where power would increasingly reside with the elected representatives of the people. The scars of the revolution would remain, woven into the national memory, a stark reminder of the consequences when a king and his people could no longer find common ground. The silence that fell across England with Cromwell's passing was not one of peace, but of holding its breath. The Commonwealth, so fiercely forged, began to unravel from within. Richard Cromwell, Oliver's son, lacked his father's iron will and political acumen. The army, once a unified force under its charismatic leader, fractured into factions, each vying for influence, each distrustful of the other. The nation, weary of military rule and the endless moral strictures, yearned for stability, for a return to something familiar, even if that familiarity had once been a source of great contention. Whispers began to circulate, tentative at first, then growing louder, of the king across the water. Charles II, the exiled son of the beheaded monarch, waited in the Netherlands, a figure both remembered and idealized by a populace disillusioned with republican experiment. General George Monk, a shrewd and pragmatic commander, saw the shifting tides. He marched his army from Scotland, not with the intent of seizing power for himself, but with a calculated ambition to restore order. His journey south was a careful dance, negotiating with various factions, ensuring his own safety and the ultimate goal of a peaceful transition. In April of 1660, Charles II issued the Declaration of Breda, a masterstroke of political maneuvering. He promised a general pardon for all acts committed during the Civil War, religious toleration, and the settlement of land disputes by Parliament. It was an olive branch extended to a nation desperate for healing, a promise of reconciliation rather than retribution. The declaration paved the way for his return, not as a conqueror, but as a balm for a fractured land. On May 29, 1660, his 30th birthday, Charles II rode into London. The streets, once silent under Puritan rule, erupted in a joyous cacophony. Bells pealed, bonfires blazed, and crowds cheered, throwing flowers in his path. It was a moment of profound national relief, a collective exhale after years of tension. The monarchy, seemingly extinguished, had been rekindled, not by force, but by a weary nation's longing. This event, known as the Restoration, marked the end of the English Republic and the return of the House of Stuart to the throne. Yet this was not a return to the absolute monarchy of his father. The intervening years had irrevocably altered the political landscape. Parliament, though it had invited Charles back, was a far stronger institution than before the Civil War. It had tasted power, had asserted its rights, and would not easily relinquish them. Charles II, a man of considerable charm and intelligence, understood this delicate balance. He was determined not to go on his travels again, as he famously quipped, a clear reference to his long exile. His reign was marked by a constant, subtle tug-of-war between Crown and Parliament. Charles sought to reassert royal prerogative, while Parliament guarded its newfound influence, particularly over taxation. The king, known for his love of pleasure and his numerous mistresses, often found himself in need of funds, giving Parliament significant leverage. He navigated these waters with a blend of affability and political cunning, avoiding direct confrontation where possible. The religious question, however, remained a festering wound. Charles, though outwardly Anglican, harboured Catholic sympathies, a fact that deeply troubled a predominantly Protestant nation. The Clarendon Code, a series of laws passed by Parliament in the early 1660s, aimed to re-establish the supremacy of the Church of England and suppress nonconformist Protestant sects. These acts, named after Charles's chief minister, Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, included the Act of Uniformity, which required clergy to accept the Anglican prayer book, leading to the expulsion of thousands of Puritan ministers. This further cemented the Church of England's position, but also created a significant dissenting population. Known detail of this period is the king's fascination with science and the arts. Charles II was a patron of the Royal Society, founded in 1660, which brought together leading scientific minds of the day. He even had a laboratory in his palace, demonstrating a keen interest in experimentation and discovery, a stark contrast to the religious fervour that had dominated the previous era. This patronage helped lay the groundwork for the Age of Enlightenment in England. The mid-1660s brought devastating trials to London. In 1665, the Great Plague swept through the city, claiming an estimated 100,000 lives, a quarter of London's population. The streets, once bustling, became eerily quiet, save for the mournful cries of "Bring out your dead." The following year, in 1666, the Great Fire of London erupted, consuming much of the medieval city. Though a catastrophe, it also provided an opportunity for rebuilding, leading to a more modern, less congested city plan, famously designed in part by Sir Christopher Wren. These events, though horrific, paradoxically strengthened Charles's bond with his people, as he remained in the city during the plague and actively participated in fighting the fire, showing a kingly resolve that resonated deeply. As Charles's reign progressed, the issue of succession became paramount. He had no legitimate children, and his heir apparent was his brother, James, Duke of York, an open and devout Catholic. This prospect ignited widespread fear of a return to Catholic dominance and potential absolutism. The Popish Plot of 1678, a fabricated conspiracy concocted by Titus Oates, alleged a Jesuit plot to murder Charles and place James on the throne. Though a complete fabrication, it inflamed anti-Catholic sentiment and led to a wave of hysteria, trials, and executions. This fear culminated in the Exclusion Crisis, 1679 to 1681, a fierce political struggle over attempts to exclude James from the succession by Act of Parliament. This period saw the emergence of the first true political parties in England. The Whigs, who supported exclusion and parliamentary power, and the Tories, who upheld royal prerogative and James's hereditary right. Historians still debate the true motivations behind the exclusion crisis. Was it a genuine fear of Catholicism and absolutism, or a cynical power play by ambitious politicians? Perhaps it was a complex blend of both, reflecting the deep-seated anxieties and political opportunism of the era. Charles, with characteristic shrewdness, outmaneuvered the Whigs, dissolving Parliament multiple times and ultimately maintaining his brother's position as heir. When Charles II died in 1685, he was succeeded by his brother, James II. James, unlike his pragmatic brother, was a man of unwavering conviction, particularly in his Catholic faith and his belief in the divine right of kings. He immediately set about pursuing policies that alienated the very institutions that had brought his family back to power. He appointed Catholics to positions in the army, government, and universities, openly defying the Test Acts that barred non-Anglicans from public office. He sought to use his royal dispensing power to override laws, a direct challenge to parliamentary authority. His actions, though seemingly aimed at religious toleration, were perceived by many as an attempt to impose Catholicism and absolute rule on England. The birth of his son, James Francis Edward Stuart, in June 1688, sealed the fate of his reign. This meant a Catholic heir, ensuring a Catholic dynasty for generations to come. The thought of a permanent Catholic monarchy, coupled with James's increasingly autocratic tendencies, was simply too much for the Protestant establishment to bear. A coalition of leading parliamentarians, both Whig and Tory, took a momentous step. They secretly invited William of Orange, the Protestant stadholder of the Dutch Republic and James's son-in-law, married to James's Protestant daughter, Mary, to intervene. William, a shrewd military and political leader, saw an opportunity to secure England as an ally against his nemesis, Louis XIV of France. In November 1688, William landed at Torbay with a large Dutch army. James, finding himself deserted by many of his own commanders, including his trusted general John Churchill, ancestor of Winston Churchill, and even his daughter Anne, found his support crumbling. He made a half-hearted attempt to resist, but his will was broken. In a move that historians still analyse for its strategic intent, James fled London in December 1688, attempting to escape to France. His flight was crucial as it was interpreted as an abdication rather than a forced removal, allowing Parliament to declare the throne vacant. This bloodless revolution, later dubbed the Glorious Revolution, was a pivotal moment in British history. Parliament, now firmly in control, offered the crown jointly to William and Mary, but not without conditions. In February 1689, they accepted the throne, but only after agreeing to the Declaration of Right, which was subsequently enacted as the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was a landmark document that fundamentally reshaped the balance of power in England. It established parliamentary supremacy, limiting the monarch's power and guaranteeing certain rights to Parliament and the people. It stipulated that the monarch could not suspend laws, levy taxes without parliamentary consent, or maintain a standing army in peacetime. It also guaranteed freedom of speech in Parliament and the right to petition the monarch. Crucially, it settled the religious question by ensuring that no Catholic could ever again inherit the throne, explicitly stating that the monarch must be Protestant. The Glorious Revolution was not merely a change of monarch. It was a profound constitutional shift. It marked the definitive end of the divine right of kings in England and the establishment of a constitutional monarchy, where the monarch ruled with the consent of Parliament and according to the law. It laid the foundation for the parliamentary democracy that would evolve over the coming centuries. Yet the glorious nature of this revolution is a point of contention for some. While it was largely bloodless in England, it ignited a period of intense conflict in Ireland, where James II, supported by French forces, attempted to regain his throne. The ensuing War of the Two Kings, culminating in the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, was brutal and had lasting repercussions for Irish history, cementing Protestant dominance. So, while glorious for some, for others, it was a time of continued struggle and oppression. William and Mary's reign saw England consolidate its position as a major European power. William, a military strategist, was focused on countering French expansionism, drawing England into a series of costly but ultimately successful wars. Mary, a popular queen, managed domestic affairs with grace and competence. Their joint reign, though relatively short, solidified the principles established by the Bill of Rights. When Mary died in 1694, William continued to rule alone. Upon his death in 1702, the crown passed to Mary's sister, Anne. Anne, the last Stuart monarch, faced her own challenges. Though she had numerous pregnancies, none of her children survived to adulthood, raising the spectre of another succession crisis. To prevent this, Parliament passed the Act of Settlement in 1701, further solidifying the Protestant succession and ensuring that the crown would pass to the House of Hanover, a German Protestant dynasty, should Anne die without issue. This act also placed further restrictions on the monarch, ensuring that judges would hold office during good behaviour, and that no monarch could leave the country without parliamentary consent. Anne's reign also saw the momentous Act of Union in 1707, which formally united the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland into a single sovereign state, Great Britain. This was a complex and often contentious process, driven by economic incentives and the desire for greater security against French ambition. While Scotland retained its own legal system and church, its parliament was dissolved, and it sent representatives to the Parliament of Great Britain in Westminster. This act, though controversial at the time, laid the groundwork for the modern British state. By the time Anne died in 1714, the British monarchy was a vastly different institution from what it had been a century earlier. The struggles of the Civil War, the Republican experiment, the Restoration, and the Glorious Revolution had forged a new path. The crown was no longer absolute, but bound by law and accountable to Parliament. The era of religious strife as a primary driver of political upheaval began to wane, replaced by evolving constitutional principles. The stage was set for a new dynasty, the Hanoverians, who would navigate the complexities of a burgeoning empire and the continued evolution of parliamentary power, further shaping the monarchy into the symbolic yet enduring institution it would become. The echoes of those tumultuous decades, of kings beheaded and kings restored, of revolutions both bloody and glorious, would forever resonate through the halls of power, a constant reminder of the delicate balance between crown and common will. The threads of succession, so often fraught with ancient claims and bloody disputes, now wove through a different tapestry of European power. With Queen Anne's passing in 1714, the Stuart line in its direct Protestant form had reached its quiet end. The Act of Settlement, a deliberate legislative act from the turn of the century, had already charted the course, bypassing numerous Catholic claimants to ensure a Protestant monarch. And so, the crown of Great Britain, with its burgeoning empire and complex political landscape, passed across the North Sea to a relatively obscure German principality. George Louis, Elector of Hanover, became King George I, a man who spoke little English and whose primary interest lay in the affairs of his beloved Hanover. This was a pivotal moment, perhaps one of the most significant shifts in the balance of power between monarch and parliament. George I's unfamiliarity with the English language and his frequent absences in Hanover inadvertently strengthened the role of his ministers. He relied heavily on those who could navigate the intricacies of British politics, most notably Robert Walpole, often regarded as Britain's first Prime Minister. Walpole, a shrewd and pragmatic statesman, understood the evolving dynamics. He cultivated a system of cabinet government where ministers, rather than the monarch, took on the primary responsibility for policy and administration, accountable to Parliament. This marked a profound yet subtle step towards the parliamentary democracy that would define Britain. The monarch still reigned, but increasingly they did not rule in the same absolute sense as their predecessors. The early Hanoverian era, despite the foreignness of its kings, was a period of relative stability and growing prosperity for Britain. The South Sea Bubble, a speculative financial crisis that burst in 1720, certainly caused widespread ruin and scandal. But the government, under Walpole's steady hand, managed to restore confidence and prevent total collapse. This incident, while a stark reminder of unchecked financial speculation, also highlighted the growing sophistication of Britain's financial markets and its burgeoning commercial power. As the 18th century unfolded, the British Empire, already a global force, began to expand with renewed vigour. The rivalry with France, a persistent theme throughout European history, played out on a grand scale across continents and oceans. From the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the fur trading posts of North America and the nascent trading factories in India, the two great powers vied for supremacy. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, often considered the first truly global conflict, was a testament to this sprawling competition. Britain emerged victorious, gaining vast territories in North America, including Canada, and solidifying its dominance in India. This war, fought under the reign of George II, further cemented Britain's position as the preeminent naval and colonial power. Yet this imperial ascent was not without its internal challenges. The very success of the 7 Years' War, with its enormous costs, led to attempts by the British government to levy taxes on its American colonies, sparking deep resentment. The cry of "no taxation without representation" echoed across the Atlantic, culminating in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. King George III, a monarch born and raised in England, unlike his predecessors, genuinely sought to exercise more direct influence in government. He was a conscientious, if sometimes stubborn, ruler who took his duties seriously. The loss of the American colonies was a profound blow, not just to the empire's territorial integrity, but also to the very idea of imperial governance. It forced a re-evaluation of how colonies were to be managed and how imperial power should be exercised. Historians still debate the extent of George III's personal culpability in the American loss. Was he an autocratic tyrant? painted by American revolutionaries, or a monarch genuinely attempting to uphold the constitutional authority of Parliament against what he perceived as rebellious insubordination. The truth, as often is the case, likely lies somewhere in between, a complex interplay of personalities, political ideologies, and economic pressures. What is clear is that the American Revolution, despite its outcome, did not halt the inexorable march of British imperial expansion elsewhere. Indeed, the late 18th and early 19th centuries saw the British Empire continue its relentless growth, particularly in India. The East India Company, initially a trading venture, had by this point transformed into a formidable political and military power, governing vast swathes of the subcontinent. The Battle of Plassey in 1757, a decisive victory for the company led by Robert Clive, effectively marked the beginning of British territorial rule in India. Through a combination of military prowess, shrewd diplomacy, and exploitation of local rivalries, the company steadily expanded its control. By the early 19th century, India was becoming the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, a source of immense wealth and prestige. The Napoleonic Wars, from 1803 to 1815, presented another existential challenge to Britain. Napoleon Bonaparte, with his ambitions of European domination, threatened British maritime supremacy and its very security. The wars, fought across Europe and at sea, saw Britain emerge as the victor, largely due to its formidable navy, epitomized by Nelson's triumph at Trafalgar in 1805, and its financial resilience. The Congress of Vienna in 1815, which redrew the map of Europe after Napoleon's defeat, further solidified Britain's global standing. It gained strategic territories like Malta, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and the Cape Colony, enhancing its control over vital trade routes. The early 19th century also witnessed significant social and economic transformations within Britain itself. The Industrial Revolution, which had been gradually gathering pace, now truly began to reshape society. New technologies, particularly in textiles and steam power, led to unprecedented economic growth, but also to profound social upheaval. Factories mushroomed, drawing populations from rural areas into rapidly expanding industrial towns. This created new classes of wealthy industrialists and a burgeoning urban working class, often living in harsh conditions. The monarchy, under George IV and then William IV, continued its gradual retreat from direct political intervention, becoming more of a symbolic head of state. The Great Reform Act of 1832, a significant piece of legislation, expanded the franchise, albeit still limited, and redistributed parliamentary seats, reflecting the changing demographics and economic power centres of the nation. It was a step, however small, towards a more representative democracy, a further erosion of ancient aristocratic privilege. Perhaps a lesser-known detail from this period concerns the royal finances. Despite the vast wealth flowing into the empire, the Hanoverian monarchs, particularly George III, faced significant personal debt at various points. The cost of maintaining their lavish households and supporting large families often outstripped the civil list, the annual sum granted by Parliament for the monarch's expenses. This led to repeated requests for parliamentary grants to clear royal debts, sometimes causing friction between the Crown and the legislature. A curious contrast to the immense wealth being generated by the empire. As the reign of William IV drew to a close, a new era was poised to begin. The empire was vast, its industrial heartland pulsed with unprecedented energy, and the parliamentary system had firmly established its supremacy. The monarch, while still a potent symbol, was increasingly becoming a figurehead, embodying the nation rather than directing its daily affairs. The stage was set for a young queen, Victoria, whose long reign would witness the zenith of British imperial power and the further evolution of its unique form of constitutional monarchy. The quiet, almost accidental shift in power that began with a German king who spoke little English had, by the mid-19th century, blossomed into a fully fledged system where the crown reigned supreme in the hearts of its people. Yet Parliament held the reins of true governance. The whispers of the past, of absolute power and divine right, were fading, replaced by the steady hum of industrial progress and the growing clamour for political representation. The gentle sway of the pendulum clock marked the passage of time, each tick a deliberate step further into an age of profound transformation. As the morning mists of 1837 lifted, a young woman, barely 18, ascended to the throne, her name Victoria, and her reign would become synonymous with an entire era. She inherited a nation still grappling with the aftershocks of industrial revolution, a society poised on the precipice of an unprecedented expansion of power, wealth, and influence. The early years of her rule were marked by a youthful optimism, a sense of burgeoning possibility that resonated across the land. It was a time when the clatter of looms and the hiss of steam engines became the new symphony of progress, reshaping landscapes and lives with astonishing speed. The Great Exhibition of 1851, housed within the magnificent Crystal Palace, stood as a glittering testament to this new age. Imagine, if you will, the sheer wonder in the eyes of visitors from across the globe as they stepped into this colossal glass edifice, a shimmering cathedral of human ingenuity. Here, beneath its soaring arches, lay displayed the marvels of British manufacturing and innovation. Intricate machinery, exotic goods from distant colonies, and inventions that promised to revolutionize daily life. It was more than just an exhibition. It was a declaration, a proud assertion of Britain's industrial supremacy, a moment when the world truly recognized the nation as the undisputed workshop of the world. This event, conceived by Victoria's beloved husband, Prince Albert, symbolized the very spirit of the age, a blend of scientific advancement, imperial ambition, and a deep-seated belief in progress. Yet beneath the polished veneer of prosperity, a different kind of transformation was quietly unfolding. The rapid urbanization spurred by industrialization led to immense social challenges. Cities swelled, often without adequate infrastructure, leading to overcrowded slums, rampant disease, and stark social inequalities. The chasm between the wealthy industrialists and the working poor widened, creating tensions that simmered beneath the surface of Victorian respectability. Philanthropists and social reformers emerged, driven by a moral imperative to alleviate suffering, their efforts laying the groundwork for future social welfare initiatives. The very fabric of society was being rewoven, thread by thread, as traditional agricultural communities gave way to bustling industrial centres, and the rhythms of rural life were replaced by the relentless hum of the factory. Victoria's personal life, marked by her deep devotion to Prince Albert, played a significant role in shaping the monarchy's image. Their marriage, a rare example of a truly loving royal union, provided a stark contrast to the scandals that had plagued previous reigns. Albert, a man of intellect and vision, became her trusted advisor, his influence extending to matters of education, science, and the arts. His untimely death in 1861 plunged Victoria into a profound grief from which she never fully recovered. For years, she retreated from public life, a reclusive figure clad in perpetual mourning, earning her the moniker the Widow of Windsor. This period of withdrawal, however, paradoxically endeared her to many of her subjects, who saw in her sorrow a reflection of their own human experience. It softened the image of the monarchy, making it seem more relatable, more human than it had been in generations. The latter half of Victoria's reign saw the British Empire reach its zenith, a vast global network of colonies and dominions upon which, it was famously said, the sun never set. From the jewel in the crown, India, to vast swathes of Africa, Canada, Australia, and beyond, British influence extended across continents. This imperial expansion was fueled by a complex mix of economic interests, strategic ambitions, and a sense of moral duty, often cloaked in the idea of bringing civil legislation to what were perceived as less developed lands. The sheer scale of this empire was unprecedented in human history, and it brought immense wealth and resources back to Britain, further cementing its position as a global superpower. However, the legacy of empire was, and remains, a complex one, marked by both progress and exploitation, a tapestry woven with threads of both glory and profound suffering. One fascinating, yet often overlooked, aspect of this era was the burgeoning interest in spiritualism and the occult, particularly after Prince Albert's death. Queen Victoria herself, in her deep grief, was rumoured to have dabbled in attempts to communicate with her deceased husband through mediums. While never officially confirmed, the widespread fascination with séances, clairvoyance, and the afterlife permeated all levels of society, from the working classes to the intellectual elite. It offered a comforting, if sometimes illusory, balm for a world grappling with rapid change and the existential questions posed by scientific advancement. This embrace of the supernatural, alongside a fervent belief in scientific progress, illustrates the intriguing contradictions that defined the Victorian age. The political landscape of Victorian Britain was dominated by the shifting tides between the Liberal and Conservative parties, led by towering figures like William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli. Their rivalry, often passionate and eloquent, shaped domestic and foreign policy for decades. Gladstone, a devout Christian and a champion of moral reform, focused on fiscal prudence and expanding the franchise, while Disraeli, with his flair for the dramatic, championed imperial expansion and social reforms aimed at improving the lives of the working class. Their debates, often conducted with fierce intellectual rigour, laid the foundations for modern parliamentary democracy, demonstrating a commitment to robust public discourse even amidst profound disagreements. Historians still debate whether Disraeli's social reforms were genuinely altruistic or primarily a strategic move to win over the working class vote, a question that speaks to the complex motivations behind political action. Technological advancements continued their relentless march forward, transforming daily life in ways previously unimaginable. The widespread adoption of the telegraph revolutionized communication, allowing messages to be sent across vast distances in mere minutes, linking the empire together with an invisible web of wires. The invention of the telephone, though initially a novelty, would soon begin to reshape personal and business interactions. Railways crisscrossed the nation, shrinking distances and enabling unprecedented mobility for goods and people. The gas lamp, and later the electric light, slowly began to push back the darkness of night, illuminating cities and homes. These innovations, seemingly mundane to us today, were nothing short of miraculous to those who lived through their introduction, fundamentally altering perceptions of time, distance, and possibility. As the 19th century drew to a close, a sense of fin de siècle melancholy began to creep into the national consciousness, a feeling that an era was ending, and with it, perhaps, a certain innocence. Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 was a spectacular display of imperial power and national pride, a last grand hurrah for the Victorian age. Yet beneath the pomp and circumstance, there were growing anxieties about the rise of other industrial powers, particularly Germany and the United States, and the increasing complexities of managing such a vast empire. The Boer War in South Africa, a protracted and costly conflict, further exposed the vulnerabilities and moral ambiguities of imperial expansion, shaking the nation's self-confidence. When Queen Victoria passed away in January 1901, after a reign of 63 years, 7 months, and 2 days, the longest in British history until surpassed by Elizabeth II, it marked the end of an epoch. Her death was met with a profound sense of loss, as she had become an almost immutable fixture in the national landscape, a grandmother figure to a vast empire. The transition to the new century brought with it a different sensibility, a shift in atmosphere that was palpable. Her son, Edward VII, ascended to the throne, ushering in the brief but distinctive Edwardian era. This period, lasting only 9 years until his death in 1910, was characterized by a distinct departure from the staid morality and earnestness of the Victorian age. Edward, a man of considerable charm and bonhomie, had long been a figure of society, known for his love of pleasure, fashion, and the good life. His reign saw a loosening of social strictures, a greater emphasis on leisure and entertainment, and a more cosmopolitan outlook. The Edwardian age was, in many ways, a golden afternoon before the storm. Society balls were grander, fashion more flamboyant, and the pursuit of pleasure more openly embraced. The wealthy elite indulged in lavish country house parties, motor cars became a symbol of status, and the nascent cinema began to capture the public imagination. It was an age of elegance and opulence for those who could afford it, a brief flourishing of high society and refined tastes. Yet, beneath the glittering surface, the seeds of future conflict were already being sown. Social reforms continued, albeit at a slower pace than some desired. The burgeoning suffragette movement gained momentum, with women increasingly demanding the right to vote, employing more militant tactics than their Victorian predecessors. The struggle for workers' rights also intensified, leading to strikes and greater calls for social justice. While the empire remained vast, its management became increasingly challenging, and the rise of nationalist movements within various colonies began to stir. International relations grew more complex and precarious. The intricate web of alliances and rivalries among European powers, particularly the growing naval arms race between Britain and Germany, cast a long shadow over the continent. Edward VII, despite his reputation as a bon vivant, played a surprisingly active role in foreign policy, often engaging in diplomatic efforts to foster better relations with France and Russia, moves that would later prove crucial in the lead-up to the First World War. His personal charm and connections helped to smooth over diplomatic tensions, earning him the nickname the uncle of Europe, due to his familial ties to many European monarchs. The Edwardian era was a bridge between two worlds: the long, stable Victorian age and the tumultuous upheavals of the 20th century. It was a time of lingering imperial grandeur, but also of growing social unrest and international anxiety. The air was filled with the scent of change, a subtle shift in the prevailing winds that hinted at the profound transformations yet to come. The horse and carriage still shared the roads with the first automobiles. Gaslight flickered alongside nascent electric street lamps, and the rigid class structures of the past slowly began to creak under the weight of new ideas and demands. As the sun set on Edward's short reign and the year 1910 dawned, few could have foreseen the cataclysm that lay just 4 years ahead. The elegance and apparent tranquility of the Edwardian summer would soon give way to the thunder of cannons, irrevocably altering the course of British history and the very nature of the monarchy itself. The world was poised on the brink of a new era, one that would test the resilience of nations and the endurance of traditions in ways previously unimaginable. The gentle whispers of progress had grown into a roar, and the quiet dignity of the past was about to be swept away by the winds of a new and uncertain future. The new century dawned not with the quiet grandeur of Victorian stability, but with the distant rumblings of a world poised on the brink of profound change. Edward VII, who ascended the throne in 1901, brought a different kind of charisma to the monarchy. He was a figure of international renown, a bon vivant who had cultivated relationships across Europe's royal houses and political spheres. His reign, though brief, was marked by a period of relative peace and prosperity for Britain, often called the Edwardian era, a final gilded age before the storm. He understood the evolving nature of diplomacy, often acting as an informal envoy, and his state visits were not merely ceremonial, but often carried subtle political weight. His funeral in 1910 was a gathering of monarchs, many of them his relatives, a stark visual representation of the interconnected, yet increasingly fragile, European order. 9 reigning kings rode in the procession, a sight that would never be seen again. His son, George V, inherited a world on the cusp of unimaginable conflict. When the Great War erupted in 1914, the intricate web of familial ties that bound Europe's monarchies together was brutally severed. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany was George V's first cousin, and Empress Alexandra of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II's wife, was another first cousin. The war was, in many ways, a family quarrel writ large, though its causes were far more complex than mere dynastic squabbles. As the conflict deepened, the German lineage of the British royal family became a source of increasing discomfort and even suspicion among the British public. The House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, their dynastic name, sounded distinctly German at a time when anti-German sentiment was at its peak. In a shrewd and pragmatic move in 1917, George V officially changed the family's name to Windsor, a name evocative of the ancient castle, firmly rooting the monarchy in British soil and identity. This act, though symbolic, was crucial in maintaining public support for the crown during a period of immense national strain. The war years were a test of endurance for the monarchy, as they were for the entire nation. George V and Queen Mary made numerous visits to hospitals, factories, and the front lines, offering solace and showing solidarity. They were often seen among the wounded, their faces etched with concern, a visible embodiment of the nation's shared suffering. The direct engagement, a departure from the more distant Victorian style, helped to solidify the bond between the monarch and the people. The war irrevocably altered the social landscape of Britain, accelerating demands for greater social equality and political reform. The unimaginable loss of life, the sheer scale of the devastation, led to a profound reassessment of traditional hierarchies and values. The monarchy, however, navigated these turbulent waters by adapting, by becoming more accessible, and by demonstrating a genuine commitment to the welfare of its subjects. The interwar period was a time of economic hardship and social unrest. The general strike of 1926, for instance, brought the country to a standstill, highlighting the deep divisions within society. Yet, the monarchy under George V remained a symbol of stability amidst the turmoil. The advent of new technologies, particularly radio, allowed the monarch to connect with the public in unprecedented ways. George V's annual Christmas broadcasts, initiated in 1932, became a cherished tradition, bringing the voice of the sovereign directly into homes across the empire. His quiet, reassuring tone, often speaking of family and continuity, resonated deeply with a populace grappling with uncertainty. These broadcasts were a masterclass in modern communication, transforming the monarch from a distant figure into a familiar presence, a voice of comfort in troubled times. However, the monarchy faced its greatest constitutional crisis, not from war or economic depression, but from a matter of the heart. Edward VIII, who ascended the throne upon his father's death in 1936, was a charismatic but unconventional figure. He had fallen deeply in love with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. The prospect of the king marrying a woman who had been twice divorced and whose previous husbands were still living was deemed unacceptable by the government, the Church of England, and much of the British public. The Church of England, of which the monarch is the supreme governor, did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons if their former spouses were still alive. Furthermore, there were concerns about Mrs. Simpson's perceived unsuitability for the role of queen, and the potential damage to the monarchy's moral standing. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin made it clear that the government would not support the marriage, and if the king proceeded, the government would resign, potentially plunging the country into a constitutional crisis. Faced with the choice between the woman he loved and the crown, Edward VIII chose love. In December 1936, after a reign of less than a year, he abdicated, the only British monarch to voluntarily relinquish the throne. His poignant radio address, declaring that he found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility without the help and support of the woman he loved, resonated across the world. This event, unprecedented in modern British history, highlighted the delicate balance between personal desire and constitutional duty, and ultimately reinforced the monarchy's commitment to its traditional role, even at great personal cost to the sovereign. His younger brother, Albert, Duke of York, unexpectedly found himself king, taking the regnal name George VI. A shy man with a stammer, he was initially daunted by the immense responsibility. Yet, he rose to the challenge with quiet dignity and unwavering resolve. He and his wife, Queen Elizabeth, became symbols of national resilience as Britain once again faced the spectre of war. The outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 brought unprecedented devastation to Britain. Unlike the First War, this conflict brought the war directly to British homes through aerial bombardment. Buckingham Palace itself was bombed 9 times, a powerful testament to the shared danger faced by the royal family and their subjects. George VI and Queen Elizabeth famously refused to leave London during the Blitz, choosing instead to remain in the capital, sharing the dangers and hardships with the ordinary people. Queen Elizabeth famously declared, "I am glad we have been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." Their presence, often seen visiting bombed-out areas, offering comfort and encouragement, was a profound source of morale for a nation under siege. They became the steadfast heart of a defiant nation, their quiet courage mirroring the resilience of the British people. Historians still debate the extent to which their presence genuinely influenced public morale versus simply reflecting it. But there is little doubt that their visible solidarity was a powerful symbolic gesture. The war years cemented the monarchy's role as a unifying national symbol, a constant amidst chaos. The images of the king and queen walking through the rubble, speaking to survivors, became iconic. The young Princess Elizabeth, a future queen, also played her part, making her first public broadcast to the children of the Commonwealth in 1940, offering words of encouragement. She later trained as a mechanic and driver in the Auxiliary Territorial Service, becoming the first female member of the royal family to serve in the armed forces. These actions, both large and small, demonstrated a profound commitment to public service and a willingness to share in the national struggle. The end of the Second World War in 1945 brought victory, but also a new set of challenges. The British Empire, though victorious, was severely weakened, and the process of decolonization began to accelerate. India gained independence in 1947, a momentous event that marked the beginning of the end for the vast imperial structure. The monarchy adapted by evolving the concept of the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of independent states, many of which had formerly been part of the British Empire, with the monarch as its symbolic head. This transformation from empire to Commonwealth was a crucial step in maintaining Britain's global influence and the monarchy's relevance in a rapidly changing world order. George VI, though a reluctant king, had proven to be a strong and dedicated monarch, guiding the nation through its darkest hours. His health, however, had been severely affected by the stresses of war and the demands of his reign. He died in 1952, a relatively young man, leaving behind a nation still recovering from war and navigating a new global landscape. His death marked the end of an era, a period defined by 2 devastating global conflicts and profound social upheaval. His daughter, Elizabeth II, ascended the throne at the age of 25. Her coronation in 1953 was a spectacle of ancient ritual and modern technology, broadcast live on television, bringing the ceremony into millions of homes for the first time. This event symbolized the monarchy's embrace of new media and its continued relevance in a world increasingly shaped by mass communication. The post-war period saw Britain grappling with economic austerity, social change, and the dismantling of its colonial empire. The monarchy, under Elizabeth II, became a constant, a symbol of continuity and stability in a world of accelerating change. The latter half of the 20th century saw the monarchy face new scrutiny and challenges. The rise of a more critical media, changing social attitudes, and a growing Republican movement meant that the royal family was no longer viewed with the same unquestioning deference as in previous generations. Public interest in their personal lives intensified, and royal marriages, divorces, and other personal struggles became front-page news. The 1990s, in particular, were dubbed the Annus Horribilis by the Queen, marked by a series of marital breakdowns among her children and a devastating fire at Windsor Castle. The public reaction to the death of Diana, Princess of Wales, in 1997, and the initial perceived lack of public mourning from the royal family, led to a period of intense reflection and adaptation for the institution. Yet, through it all, the monarchy endured. Elizabeth II, with her unwavering dedication to duty and her calm, steady presence, became a globally recognized figure of stability and continuity. She embraced technological advancements, from the internet to social media, using them to connect with a wider audience. Her annual Christmas messages continued the tradition established by her father, offering reflections on national and global events. She undertook countless engagements, both at home and abroad, acting as a tireless ambassador for Britain and the Commonwealth. Her reign, the longest in British history, spanned an extraordinary period of transformation, from the fading echoes of empire to the dawn of the digital age. She witnessed the rise of the European Union and its eventual departure, the invention of the internet, and the profound shifts in global power dynamics. The monarchy, by the turn of the 21st century, had evolved from an imperial power into a more symbolic and ceremonial institution, yet one that retained significant soft power and cultural influence. It had navigated world wars, constitutional crises, social revolutions, and intense media scrutiny. Its survival and continued relevance lay in its remarkable adaptability, its willingness to embrace change while holding on to core traditions, and its consistent dedication to public service. The winds of the 20th century had indeed been tempestuous, but the monarchy, like an ancient oak, had bent but not broken. Its roots reaching ever deeper into the soil of British history, ready to face the challenges of a new millennium. The echoes of empire, once a resounding declaration of global reach, began to soften, then fade, as the 20th century unfolded. The British monarchy, once at the apex of a vast dominion, found itself navigating a world irrevocably altered by 2 world wars, the rise of new ideologies, and the relentless tide of decolonization. The very fabric of its power, woven through centuries of conquest and consolidation, was now being restitched into a different pattern. The once unquestioned authority of the crown shifted, subtly at first, then more overtly, towards a role defined by symbolism, continuity, and a quiet, enduring presence. The reign of Elizabeth II, beginning in 1952, spanned this profound transformation. She ascended the throne not as an empress, but as a queen inheriting a commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent nations that had once been part of the empire. This transition was a delicate dance, requiring immense diplomatic skill and a willingness to embrace a new paradigm. Her early tours of these newly independent nations were not triumphal processions of imperial might, but gestures of goodwill and partnership, acknowledging shared history while respecting newfound sovereignty. The crown became a unifying thread, not a binding chain. The mid-20th century also saw a dramatic increase in media scrutiny. The advent of television brought the monarchy directly into living rooms, demystifying some aspects while simultaneously amplifying others. The coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953 was a landmark event, broadcast live to millions across the globe, allowing an unprecedented intimacy with the ancient rituals. Yet this newfound visibility also meant that the personal lives of the royals became subjects of public fascination and at times intense debate. The traditional mystique, carefully cultivated over centuries, began to yield to a more accessible, albeit still distant, presence. The role of the monarch evolved from a governing power to a constitutional head of state, a shift that had been gradually occurring since the Glorious Revolution. By the latter half of the 20th century, the monarch's duties were primarily ceremonial, opening Parliament, approving legislation, bestowing honours, and acting as Commander-in-Chief of the armed forces. These duties, though largely symbolic, carried immense weight, representing the continuous thread of the nation's history and its democratic processes. The sovereign became a guardian of tradition, a living embodiment of the state's continuity, standing above the shifting sands of political tides. One lesser-known aspect of this adaptation involved the royal family's deliberate efforts to modernize their public image. In the 1960s, there was an attempt to portray the royals as more relatable, culminating in the 1969 documentary Royal Family, which offered an unprecedented, though carefully curated, glimpse into their daily lives. While intended to foster connection, this experiment also sparked debate about the appropriate balance between public accessibility and the preservation of royal mystique. Historians still disagree whether this period of increased transparency ultimately strengthened or weakened the monarchy's long-term standing in a rapidly changing society. Some argue it humanized them, making them more palatable to a skeptical public, while others contend it chipped away at the very awe and reverence that underpinned their unique position. The late 20th and early 21st centuries presented new challenges. The rise of Republican sentiment, particularly in the wake of certain personal difficulties experienced by members of the royal family, tested the institution's resilience. Yet through these periods, the monarchy demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation. They embraced new technologies, from engaging with social media to utilizing digital platforms for public communication. Royal visits, once formal affairs, became opportunities for walkabouts and direct interaction with the public, reflecting a more approachable style. The ceremonial duties, far from diminishing in importance, often took on new resonance. State visits, garden parties, and investitures became moments where the nation could celebrate its achievements, honor its citizens, and project an image of stability and tradition to the world. The Trooping the Colour, the state opening of Parliament, and the Garter Day procession, ancient rituals steeped in history, continued to draw crowds, not as displays of power, but as vibrant expressions of national identity and continuity. These events, meticulously choreographed, served as a living bridge between the past and the present, connecting modern Britain to its rich, complex heritage. The monarch also continued to serve as a vital, albeit subtle, diplomatic asset. State visits by the sovereign could often smooth relations, open doors, and reinforce alliances in ways that political negotiations alone could not. The soft power of the crown, built on centuries of history and a reputation for impartiality, proved invaluable in fostering international goodwill and strengthening Britain's standing on the global stage. As the 21st century progressed, the question of the monarchy's future continued to be a subject of quiet contemplation. With King Charles III's accession, the institution entered a new chapter, facing a world grappling with environmental crises, technological revolutions, and shifting social values. The challenge remained to balance tradition with modernity, to uphold the ancient dignity of the crown while reflecting the aspirations of a diverse and evolving nation. The core role, however, seemed to remain constant, to serve as a symbol of unity, a repository of national memory, and a constant, reassuring presence amidst the ebb and flow of contemporary life. The crown, no longer wielding direct political power, had transformed into a profound cultural and historical anchor, its enduring light shining not through command, but through continuity and quiet dedication.